Good evening, guys. Today we are going to be talking about Andrew Carnegie and his economic success. So, when we are talking about economics in the United States and we're looking at businessmen who are successful, one of those is going to be Andrew Carnegie. However, according to Barry Weingast, one of the reasons for this is that federalism thus proved the solution to the dilemma of how to limit the state's protectionist activities without providing the national government with too much power. The consequence was one of the largest common markets in the world, one with a strong protection of property rights and an absence of economic regulation. And it's going to be this absence of economic regulation that are going to lead to some very prominent men rising to power. One of those men being Andrew Carnegie. He is a self made man. He immigrated to the United States in 1848 with his family, and he worked many jobs. He started when he was 13 in a textile mill. He's eventually going to hold several different hats. He will go into the telegraph industry. He will also go into the railroad industry, and it's going to be while he's in the railroad industry that he learns how to invest in the stock market. He starts making some very wise choices with his money. That's eventually going to allow him to start his own steel company. Now, in the early 1870s, he is a co-founder of a company, but he's eventually going to start his own Carnegie Steel. So, in the 1870s, when many businessmen were not making wise decisions or they were hurt by the Panic of 1873, he was not. In fact, his business was actually growing and he was actually making a new steel mill as that happened. So let's look at his successes. Something that he does do is that he starts buying all of these steel mills and businesses during the financial slump in 1873. And that's because all of these other guys are having to sell. They can't make their payments, and so he's having to cover them. Actually, in his autobiography, that's one of the things that he talks about. He says, when the cyclone of 1873 struck us, we at once began to reef rail in every quarter. Very reluctantly did we decide that the construction of the new steel must cease for a time. Several prominent persons who had invested in them became unable to meet their payments, and I was compelled to take over their interest, repaying the full cost to all. In that way, control of the company came into my hands. So here we see this is partly reason why he is so successful. Another one is that he actually makes really good investments. Like I said, he buys smaller railroad companies, and so he's going to cut out perhaps the middleman. So David Mayer, in his article that we read this week, says by purchasing large amounts of transportation services, wholesalers received discounts that individual factories did not obtain. Those low transportation and marketing costs made the Midwestern prices for consumers close to the Eastern production costs. Thus, Midwestern firms could not challenge the dominant Eastern firms. This is exactly what Andrew Carnegie did. He cut out the middleman. By buying up all these smaller railroad companies, he no longer had to worry about that cost. So he's going to use vertical integration. He's going to buy everything that he's going to need to make his company successful, from iron ore mines to the railroad industry. And steel mills. He's going to have it all. Even when he was on vacation, he actually was still a businessman. In his book called Round the World, he said no one can be presented at these meetings without being impressed with the amount and thoroughness of the scientific knowledge now engaged in the iron and steel manufacture of Great Britain. Not less remarkable seemed to me the willingness upon the part of all to report and explain every advance made in the various processes to their fellows. The old idea of trade secrets seems thoroughly exploded in a free interchange of practice, and theory is now seen to be best for all. So when he's talking about all of these men coming together in his trip around the world. He stops in London, and they're talking about these new scientific methods. Primarily, they're talking about the bessemer process, which was a new way to heat iron to make steel. It made it cheaper, it made it stronger. And so a lot of industries in the United States were headed towards using steel. And Carnegie is going to capitalize on that. Eventually, in the early 1900s, he's going to sell his steel company to J.P. Morgan for $480 million. So let's talk about Carnegie and labor, because this is something that we often see in the history books. We see what happens with the Homestead strike in 1892. But his view on labor from an excerpt in the Gospel of Wealth states, "It is notable that bitter strikes seldom occur in small establishments where the owner comes in direct contact with his men and knows their qualities, their struggles, and their aspirations." So when he's talking about this in his Gospel of Wealth, but then we know that the Homestead strike happened in 1892. But according to his account, this is what happens. The manufacture of steel was revolutionized by the Bessemer open hearth and basic inventions. The machinery hitherto employed had become obsolete, and our firm, recognizing this, spent several millions at Homestead reconstructing and enlarging the works. The new machinery made about 60% more steel than the old. 218 tonnage men, that is, men who were paid by the ton of steel produced, were working under a 3 year contract, part of that last year being the new machinery. Thus, their earnings had increased almost 60% before the end of the contract. The firm offered to divide this 60% with them in the new scale to be made thereafter. That is to say, the earnings of the men would have been 30% greater than under the old scale, and the other 30% would have gone to the firm to recompense it for its outlay. The work of the men would not have been much harder than it had been hitherto, as the improved machinery did the work. Now, what he does go on to say is that when actually the Homestead strike happened, he was not even in the United States. He was, in fact, in Scotland, and some of his business partners didn't even want him to come back when that happened. But he's claiming that part of that was those 218 men that wanted more money, and part of that was because of government contracts that Carnegie was currently working on. So although we see this wealth accomplished by such a man, because remember, he is that rags to riches tale, that American dream that everybody was coming after. He is this immigrant that came from Scotland. His family was very poor when they got here. He worked his way up and was and has been one of the richest men in U.S. history. But he didn't keep all of that. We know that he was a philanthropist and gave away most of his wealth. So here is the bibliography, on Andrew Carnegie. Thank you.